What would you do if the HOA called the cops on you while you were standing on your own cliffside mansion? I came home after years away, only to find the HOA had built a steel gate across my road and called the cops to arrest me on my own rooftop. They thought I'd disappeared. They thought they could rewrite the entire bay. But they never checked what I still owned. And when the truth surfaced, the whole community felt the shake. The first thing Remy noticed wasn't the siren. It was the color. Red and blue strobed across the glass walls of the cliffside mansion, breaking the soft gold of the late afternoon sun into sharp, violent flashes. The reflections chased each other across the polished floor, racing up the curved staircase like lightning, trapped inside a shell of glass and steel. He set the coffee mug down on the kitchen counter and listened. Engines. More than one. Tires crunching over gravel and grass on the rooftop drive above him. Doors slamming. Radio chatter carried on the wind, clipped and official. The low murmur of voices moving with purpose. Remy stepped out onto the main terrace, barefoot. The cool smoothness of the glass floor, a familiar sensation beneath his soles. Wind rolled up from the ocean below, salt-heavy and damp, brushing through his dark hair and plastering his t-shirt against his chest. The turquoise water crashed against the rocks 200 feet down, sending spray up in pale ghosts that dissolved before they reached him. Above, on the wide stretch of living green roof that doubled as a driveway, 3 patrol cars sat at sharp angles, their light bars spinning. The bright, pulsing colors painted the whole mansion in emergency tones, turning the white concrete supports and curved glass into something that looked like it was under siege. He squinted, eyes tracking movement. Uniforms. At least 6 deputies he could see, silhouettes pacing along the edge of the roof. A few had drifted toward the curved glass railing that wrapped the upper balconies, hands resting near their holsters as they peered down at him like he was something they'd found washed up on the rocks. And at the center of it all, framed against the sky like she owned the horizon, stood Bethany Reed. Even at this distance, she was impossible to miss. The suit she wore was such a violent shade of pink it almost hurt to look at. The jacket was tailored to a knife's edge, the skirt narrow enough to force short, sharp steps. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a helmet of waves that didn't move in the wind. In one manicured hand, she gripped a leather folio like it was a weapon. In the other, she pointed straight at him. "That's him!" Her voice cut clean through the wind and the surf. A shrill, practiced projection that had probably cowed more than a few neighbors at HOA meetings. "That's the man I told you about. He's illegally occupying community property. He is not a resident of Sterling Bay Estates, and he has refused all lawful orders to vacate." Remy raised a hand to shield his eyes from the spinning lights, just long enough to make out the sheriff's deputy nearest her. Mid-40s, maybe, stocky under the tan uniform, hand resting on a holstered sidearm in a way that said he'd rather not use it, but would if it kept things simple. The deputy glanced down at Remy, then back at Bethany. Even from here, Remy could see the uncertainty in his posture. "Ma'am?" the deputy said, voice carried faintly on the wind. "You said the structure was condemned, that—" "It is condemned," Bethany snapped, the pink of her suit blazing under the lights. "By the Sterling Bay Coastal Committee and the HOA Architectural Board. We have authority over every visible structure on this coast. He's trespassing on common area property and occupying a hazardous building. You heard the report. You have probable cause." She wasn't looking at the deputy anymore. Her eyes were locked on Remy. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him like that. Like a problem. Like a stain on a clean surface. He took a breath, tasting salt and the faint metallic tang of distant rain. Behind him, the mansion curved inward, 3 tiers of glass and living greenery spiraling up from the cliff like a nautilus shell. It was the one constant in a life that had been mostly spent on platforms and ships, under gray skies and white fluorescent lights. This house, this view, this strip of coast where he'd learned to read waves before he could read words. He stepped closer to the terrace rail and called up, voice steady. "This is my property," he said. "My name is Remy Cole. I own this house and the land it sits on. I have the deed and the county survey in my office. If someone had knocked on the door, instead of bringing half the sheriff's department, I would have gladly shown you." One of the deputies shifted, looking down at him with something like sympathy. Bethany's laugh sliced across the space between them. "Your property?" she echoed, savoring each syllable like it was sour candy. "You think you can just sail in here, plant yourself in that eyesore, and play house in my bay? Sweetheart, this community has standards. We don't recognize squatters with fantasy paperwork." The word hit harder than he expected. Squatter. For a moment, a different sound layered over the sirens in his ears. The echo of steel doors closing somewhere far from any ocean. The hollow boom of them settling into concrete. The sense of being locked away while people who'd never set foot in this place decided what was safe and what wasn't. He pushed that memory down. "Sir!" Another deputy leaned over the upper railing now, a younger man, clean-shaven, brow furrowed. "I'm going to need you to stay where you are. Keep your hands where I can see them. We've had multiple reports of trespassing and unauthorized occupancy. Let's keep things calm, all right?" "Reports from whom?" Remy asked, though he already knew the answer. Bethany raised her folio like a judge about to deliver a ruling. "From the HOA Board of Sterling Bay Estates," she called. "From the Coastal Preservation Committee. From concerned residents who have to look at that thing every time they drink their morning coffee." She gestured at the mansion, like it was a rusting shipwreck. "That structure violates our view, protections, our environmental standards, and our safety codes. It blocks community access to the overlook and destabilizes the cliff. The community rejected it years ago." He almost laughed at that, the sound catching in his throat. Years ago, when the foundation was poured, there had been no community. No steel gate with a gold HOA seal, no line of identical pastel houses along the ridge, no monthly newsletters reminding people to match their shutters and hide their trash cans. Just a sleepy harbor, a few working boats, and an open stretch of wild coastline. "Deputy," Remy said, forcing his eyes off Bethany and up to the sheriff's man in charge. "I don't want trouble, but I'm telling you plainly, this is my home. I've been away working offshore. I came back 2 days ago. If the HOA has an issue with my architecture, they can take it up with the county. What they can't do is fabricate authority they don't have." Bethany's face flushed, cheeks going a mottled red that clashed badly with the pink of her suit. "You hear that?" she snapped, turning to the deputies. "He admits he's been gone. He has no active residency. Meanwhile, our records show this structure has been condemned for 6 years. Legally, it's treated as common area hazard. That gives the association the right to control access until it's demolished." Condemned for 6 years. The words dropped into his mind like rocks into deep water. That wasn't just wrong. It was impossible. He'd paid the taxes, kept the insurance, maintained the permits on the seawall and storm drain system. He'd sat in a cramped office in Galveston and renewed the coastal engineering certifications himself. There was no way the county had condemned the mansion without a single letter reaching him. Unless... "Sir," the older deputy said, stepping forward now, taking control. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step back from the edge, keep your hands visible, and come up the stairs slowly. We need to sort this out at the station. You're not under arrest right now, but if you refuse a lawful order, that can change." The word lawful hung in the air between them, heavy as the fog rolling in off the ocean. Remy looked up at the line of uniforms, then at Bethany standing rigid and victorious, her heels planted like stakes in the grass. Beyond them, on the neighboring cliffs, he could see shapes gathering, residents, some in golf shirts, some in yoga pants and fleece vests, all of them drawn out by the lights and the promise of a show. To them, he realized, he probably did look like an intruder. A man in a plain shirt, bare feet on a glass terrace, in a mansion no one had ever seen occupied, now surrounded by cops. 4 steps would take him back inside, to his office where the deed sat in a fireproof safe. 10 minutes would be enough to print every record that proved she was lying. But that wasn't the game being played here. She hadn't called for a conversation. She'd called for a spectacle. The wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and cut grass from the rooftop lawn, mixing with the salt. Somewhere down below, a wave hit the cliff just right, sending up a spray that glimmered like shattered glass before falling away. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll come up." He lifted his hands slowly, fingers spread, and stepped back from the terrace rail. The mansion's interior lights cast his shadow long across the glass as he crossed to the exterior stairwell that spiraled up along the curve of the structure. The climb felt longer than it should have. Halfway up, he passed one of the secondary balconies where 2 deputies waited, weapons holstered but eyes sharp. One moved behind him, a polite but firm hand resting in the air, not quite touching his back, but close enough to remind him of its presence. At the top, the rooftop opened up in a wide stretch of green and gravel bordered by low safety rails and integrated lighting. Up close, the patrol cars seemed even larger, their light bars throwing wild colors across the white trunks of the ornamental trees Bethany's committee had forced everyone to plant. She stepped forward as he emerged, heels stabbing into the turf, lips curled. "Remy Cole," she said, tasting the name like something sour. "We've been expecting you to try something like this. You should have stayed gone." He met her eyes. Close up, the makeup was heavy enough to crack at the corners when she smiled. "Funny," he said. "Nobody from the association bothered to reach out when you decided my house belonged to you." "It belongs to the community," she shot back. "At least until it's torn down. You never finished your approvals, never registered as a resident. You abandoned it. The bylaws are clear. Unclaimed hazardous structures revert to HOA control, especially when they threaten shared views and safety." "Ma'am," the deputy said, tone warning now. "Let us handle—" "No," Bethany cut in, voice climbing. "You handle your job, I'll handle mine. This man is a trespasser and I want him removed from this property today." The older deputy sighed, then turned to Remy, professional mask back in place. "Mr. Cole, at this time you're being detained for investigation of criminal trespass and failure to comply with a community safety order. We'll take you down to the station, verify your claims about ownership, and sort this out. Turn around, place your hands behind your back, please." For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between his shoulder blades. The reflex to resist flickered in him, born from long months in places where letting someone put you in restraints could mean never getting them off. But that was then. This was here. And if there was one thing he understood better than cliffs and currents, it was patience. You didn't fight a tide head-on. You let it take you, just far enough, then turned when it was ready to help you back. He exhaled, slow. "Deputy," he said, "I'll cooperate. But you should know this now. Whatever's in your file, whatever she's told you, it isn't the whole story." He turned, offering his wrists. The cuffs were cold against his skin, the metal clicking shut with a finality that echoed louder than the waves below. As they walked him toward the nearest patrol car, the crowd on the neighboring balconies leaned in, hungry for details they would later turn into gossip and half-truths. Bethany walked a few paces behind, phone already in hand, thumbs flying as she composed whatever version of this scene she would blast out in the next HOA bulletin. Remy lifted his head one last time, eyes tracing the curve of the bay, the wooden docks, the sleek boats bobbing in the sheltered water, the warning signs about community access and HOA permits posted along the cliff path. Everyone here thought they knew who owned this place. As the patrol car door opened and the deputy guided him down, a question rose at the back of his mind. Sharp, bitter, almost absurd. How exactly had they convinced themselves he didn't belong on land and water that had been his long before their precious gate ever existed? 48 hours earlier, none of the patrol cars were there. Just the sound of an old engine grinding up a coastal road, and a cloud of dust trailing a sun-faded pickup. The 2003 Chevy rattled as it rounded the final curve, its paint the color of dried salt, its bed loaded with tool chests and weather-stained duffels. The coastal air pushed in through the half-open window, smelling of kelp, wet stone, and distant rain. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries thin against the low mechanical growl. Remy leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield. The afternoon sun flashed across the ocean, blinding him for a second before the angle shifted and the turquoise surface came back into focus, speckled with whitecaps. 8 years, he thought. 8 years since he'd driven this road. He could feel every one of them in his hands. The calluses on his palms were thicker now, layered from years of work on steel decks that froze in the wind and bucked under his boots. His right forearm flexed as he downshifted, the faded anchor tattoo there catching the light. Lines blurred by sun and time, but still unmistakable. The road narrowed as it hugged a granite outcropping, then opened suddenly. There it was. The mansion rose from the cliff like something half-grown, half-built. 3 tiers of curved glass and green roof spiraling up from a base of white concrete, anchored deep into the stone. In the sunlight, the windows shimmered like scales, reflecting the sea in fragments. Waves surged against the rocks below, sending spray high enough that, on the worst days, he knew it could slap the underside of the lowest balcony. He eased off the gas, letting the truck roll, and for a moment the world narrowed to the sound of the tires crunching on the gravel and the rhythmic thud of his own heartbeat. Home. His throat tightened unexpectedly. He saw his father's hands in his mind's eye, broad, scarred, steady, as they traced lines across the first set of blueprints on the kitchen table. Saw the way his father had stood at this same overlook in an old windbreaker, hair whipped gray by the ocean, eyes bright as a boy's, as he watched the concrete trucks snake their way down the half-graded road. "We'll build something that belongs here, not just sits here," the old man had said. "Something the storms can't bully." They'd nearly pulled it off. Remy shifted his gaze to the right, following the curve of the cliff. The rest of the bay spread out in a shallow crescent, rows of new houses along the ridge, all angles and glass and pale siding, facing the water like spectators in a stadium. Wooden docks jutted out from the base of the hill, hosting an assortment of boats, sleek white runabouts, a couple of fishing skiffs, a pontoon or two. He didn't remember any of that from the last time he'd been here. Back then, Sterling Bay had been more working harbor than resort. Half-faded bait shack, a few weather-beaten cottages, a lot more pickup trucks than luxury SUVs. He frowned, easing the truck forward, following the familiar downhill grade toward the mansion. That was when he saw it. The road didn't open into the gravel apron he remembered. It dead-ended into steel. A gate stood across the narrow access road, a solid, freshly galvanized barrier spanning from rock face to rock face. It was tall enough that he couldn't see over it from the truck, topped with a row of blunt spikes that looked ornamental until you imagined trying to climb them. At the center of the gate, welded into a decorative crest, was a circular logo. Sterling Bay Estates, Housing Association, in proud raised letters. Underneath, a smaller placard read, "Private access. Residents and approved guests only." Just below that, a black security camera, its glass eye glossy and new, pointed straight down the road at his hood. He tapped the brakes, truck lurching to a stop. For a second, all he heard was the engine ticking and the whisper of wind coming down off the hill. Then came the slow, dawning realization. They'd closed off his road. His road. He let out a breath through his teeth, shifted into park, and killed the engine. The sudden silence made the surf below sound louder, a constant, restless roar beneath the cliff. He opened the door and stepped out, boots landing on the packed dirt. Up close, the gate smelled like hot metal and fresh paint. The welds were still silver and clean, unblemished by rust. He ran his fingers along one of the vertical bars, feeling the cold roughness where a grinder had chewed away a burr and not been sanded smooth. "Installed less than 6 months ago," he murmured. He stepped back and scanned the edges. The posts were sunk directly into the rock, anchored with epoxy and expansion bolts. Whoever had commissioned it had paid for a solid job. They just hadn't asked the right person's permission. Beside the gate, a small speaker and keypad were mounted on a brushed steel post, the kind used for call boxes in private communities. A faded plastic sticker under the speaker offered a generic instruction: "Press to call security." He stared at the button. He could have turned the truck around, driven back up to the highway, called the county first, made some quiet inquiries. But 8 years of being treated like a problem in other people's systems had left him with very little patience for barriers on roads he'd personally surveyed. He pressed the button. Static crackled. Then a woman's voice emerged, clipped, bored, the kind of tone you got from someone who spent most of their day telling delivery drivers they were in the wrong lane. "Sterling Bay Estates Security?" "Yeah," Remy said. "Got a gate where my driveway used to be." A beat of silence. "Sir, this is a private community. Residents and registered guests only. If you're looking for public beach access, you'll need to return to the main highway and follow the signs to—" "I'm not looking for beach access," he cut in. "My name is Remy Cole. I own the property at the end of this road, the cliffside home. 10 acres, parcel numbers ending in 27 and 31. I'd appreciate it if you opened the gate." Another pause. This one tighter. "One moment." The line went dead, but the faint red light on the camera blinked to a steady glow, tracking him as he shifted his weight. He heard it before he saw it. The high electric whine of a small motor and the crunch of small tires over gravel. A golf cart came into view around the bend above, descending like some kind of tiny chariot. It was glossy white with chrome trim, the Sterling Bay Estates logo stamped on the side in gold. 2 men in navy polo shirts sat in the back, arms crossed, their expressions carefully blank. Driving, of course, was Bethany. He recognized her from the first photo a realtor had sent, trying to convince him to reconsider his underutilized asset as Sterling Bay modernized. The photo hadn't done her justice. In person, she was sharper, more precise. A woman built of angles and intention. The pink suit looked almost fluorescent under the bright sky, the color reflecting faintly onto her throat and chin. A diamond tennis bracelet glittered at her wrist as she pulled the cart to a stop just inside the gate and stepped out, smoothing her skirt with one hand while she tucked a tablet under her arm with the other. She didn't speak at first. She stood there, on the other side of the bars, and let her gaze travel from his boots to his sun-darkened forearms, to the days of stubble on his jaw, taking in every detail with the quick efficiency of someone used to categorizing people at a glance. "Good afternoon," she said finally. Her smile was crisp and professional. "I'm Bethany Reed, president of the Sterling Bay Estates Homeowners Association. This is a private access road." "So I've heard," Remy said. "I'm the one who built it." Something flickered behind her eyes, then smoothed away. "I see," she said. "And you are?" "Remy Cole," he repeated. owner of parcel 27 and 31, the Cliff House. I'm afraid that's not accurate, she replied, almost gently, like she was correcting a child. That structure was condemned 6 years ago. The association was granted control of the site as a hazardous common area under our coastal safety initiative. No one may occupy it. Condemned. The word landed the same way here as it would 2 days later on the roof, heavy and out of place. That's interesting, he said slowly, because I've been paying taxes on that structure every year. Insurance, too. Coastal permits. Funny no one mentioned a condemnation hearing. She shifted her weight, the pink fabric of her skirt catching the breeze. Not all processes require the owner's presence, she said, especially in matters of community safety. When a structure is abandoned and poses a risk to the surrounding properties, the association has both a right and a duty to act. It wasn't abandoned, he said. I was working overseas. That tends to happen when you're a coastal engineer. Waves and currents don't take holidays. One of the security men in the back snorted quietly, then coughed when Bethany shot him a look. Mr. Cole, she said, voice losing some of its sugar. The fact remains, you have not been a resident. You did not complete HOA architectural approvals. You did not attend any of the community planning sessions. Legally, that structure no longer functions as a private residence. It is classified as a condemned hazardous installation under the authority of the Sterling Bay Coastal Committee. She lifted her tablet, tapping a few times, then turned the screen so that it faced him through the bars. There, in small, official-looking text, he saw it. A document with the county logo and a file number, stamped condemned in red. The date in the corner read 6 years earlier. The signature line bore a name he didn't recognize, under the title, Chair, Sterling Bay Coastal Committee. He watched the numbers, the dates, the seals, then his gaze slid lower, to a line most people wouldn't think to check. Committee formation date. The ink there showed a date 3 months after the condemnation order had supposedly been issued. His pulse ticked up once, then leveled. He smiled, slow and humorless. Your committee's efficient, he said. Condemning structures before it technically exists. That's a neat trick. Bethany's lips thinned. You're not qualified to argue committee procedure, she said. You're certainly not qualified to endanger a community I've spent 17 years protecting. Protecting, he echoed, glancing past her at the neat rows of houses. Is that what you call gating off roads you don't own? Her eyes hardened. This gate is community property, she said. Installed through dues you never paid, according to rules you never bothered to follow. You don't live here, Mr. Cole. You never have. You built a monument on a cliff and walked away. We cleaned up the mess. Wind pushed between them, rustling the ornamental grasses near the post, carrying the far-off clang of halyards against masts in the marina. Remy took a breath. Open the gate, he said quietly. No, Bethany replied, just as quietly. I'm not authorizing access to a condemned hazard. If you have paperwork you believe is valid, you can present it to our legal counsel. Until then, you're trespassing on a private road. The two security men shifted, straightening, the muscles in their forearms tightening where their hands rested on their belts. For a long moment, no one spoke. Remy looked past Bethany, up the hill, where a few of the nearer houses were just beginning to show signs of life. Someone on a deck with a glass of wine, a kid's bike, lying in a manicured yard, a dog trotting along a path. All of it framed against the bay he'd grown up on. The bay his father had worked, charted, and in the end, entrusted to him in ways Bethany clearly had never bothered to understand. You really think this place belongs to you? He said. Her smile returned, brittle and bright. It belongs to the people who care for it, she said. Not to a man who disappeared for 8 years and decides he can just roll back in and claim a throne. He let his gaze drift back to the tablet screen, to that damning red word and the dates that didn't match. Condemned. Classified. Committee. Things weren't adding up. And if there was one thing he knew, after a lifetime of reading currents and structures, it was that when numbers didn't line up, something somewhere was under stress. Something somewhere was going to crack. He stepped back from the gate, dust crunching under his heel, and gave her one last look. "I'll be back," he said, with more than a name and a memory. "I look forward to watching you fail properly," she answered. As he climbed back into the truck and turned it around, the camera on the post swiveled, tracking his every move. The red light pulsed steadily, recording, judging. He let the engine idle at the curve for a second, eyes on the mansion perched alone on the cliff beyond the barrier. They had welded steel across his road and called it protection. They had stamped condemned on his home and called it safety. They had rewritten the story of this bay so often, so loudly, that somewhere along the line they'd begun to believe it themselves. The question that would haunt him 48 hours later, as cold metal closed around his wrists, rose for the first time here, quiet and incredulous. Who exactly had given them the right to pretend he no longer existed? The next morning broke with a thin veil of fog clinging to the cliffs, drifting like pale smoke between the pines. Remy's truck rolled along the final bend once more, climbing the steep grade toward the inaccessible home he had poured half his life into. The gate waited again, steel and smug, but this time he didn't stop. He parked off the shoulder and followed the old footpath, barely visible now, cutting down the side of the ravine. His boots brushed against dew-soaked grass as he descended. The path had once been a simple gravel track used by contractors during construction. Most of it had been swallowed back by nature, but he knew every bend of the cliff by memory. He ducked beneath a cedar branch and stepped up onto the back landing, a weathered slab of concrete tucked beneath the lowest cantilever. The mansion loomed above him, all curved glass and clean lines, the mist softening its edges. Up close, it still felt alive, like something that breathed with the wind and shifted with the sun. Every angle had been designed to redirect the force of storms. Every beam was engineered to absorb the violence of the Pacific without breaking. He slid his hand along the cool glass, remembering the night he and his father had pressed their palms against the first finished panel, grinning like idiots. They hadn't known then that storms would eventually come from the landward side, not from the sea. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar panels and salt trapped in old ventilation ducts. Dust had settled along counters, softening the edges of the stainless steel fittings. The floor-to-ceiling windows stretched so tall they fractured the morning light into beams that drifted across the room like underwater currents. He wandered through the lower level slowly. His father's old drafting table still stood near the west wall, its surface clean except for a single pencil left behind, one of those heavy carpenter's pencils his father always preferred. The edges were dull now, but he could almost hear the scratch of lead mapping out load paths on parchment. He climbed the spiral steps to the main floor, boots whispering over the smooth stone tiles. Every step stirred old memories, the clang of rebar cages, the grind of concrete trucks backing down the access road, the distant laughter of workers eating lunch on overturned buckets. He paused at the large circular window overlooking the bay. From here he could see the arch of docks stretching from the other side of the cove, the bright clusters of kayaks, the brand-new white marina building the HOA had installed sometime in his absence. But it wasn't just the marina. It was the people. Neighbors stood on their balconies again, coffee mugs in hand. Their posture was unmistakable, curious, wary, a quiet confusion tugging their expressions downward. They whispered, heads leaning close. From this distance he couldn't hear the words, but he knew the cadence. "There's a man at the cliff house. Thought it was condemned." Didn't the HOA take control? Who is he? He didn't wave. Didn't try to soften their curiosity. He just turned away, letting the glass wall slide back into place behind him. The echo of his footsteps followed him into the lab, the lowest level of the mansion, set partly into the rock itself. It was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he was larger now, in a way that had nothing to do with inches. The lab still held its shape, the metal workbench bolted to the wall, the built-in shelving for tide monitors and current gauges, the computer housing that had once tracked pressure readings along the fault line offshore. Dust coated the monitors, and a faint film of salt clung to the rubber seals around the storage lockers. A journal sat on the counter, its edges curled. His father's neat handwriting filled the open page, notes about water clarity and seasonal current shifts. He closed it gently. When he returned upstairs, something fluttered by the door. A slip of bright paper, orange, glossy, unmistakable. He bent to pick it up. Violation notice, Sterling Bay Estates. HOA, unauthorized occupancy. Immediate action required. Below it was another. Window tint out of compliance, roofing vegetation exceeds approved height structure, causing visual disruption to community harmony. His laugh came out sharp, humorless. Visual disruption, he muttered, as though he had designed the mansion to spite them, as though it wasn't here first. He stepped outside to look closer. There were at least 10 violations now taped along the entryway, neon flags plastered beside the doorframe, anchored against the morning breeze. They looked almost festive, fluttering like paper lanterns at a bad parade. He followed them around the curve of the house, past the infinity edge balcony, where raindrops gathered on the railing. More notices, more colors. Someone had taken the time to photograph the violations and upload them to the HOA site. That much he knew instinctively. They would have timestamps, fake signatures, and meaningless citations. He reached the back railing and leaned forward, hands gripping the cool metal. Below, the ocean pulsed against the cliff, sending out a low, rhythmic thunder. For a moment, he let the sound wash through him. The world narrowed to wind, salt, and the deep, steady heartbeat of water against stone. A shadow moved on the nearest balcony across the bay. A woman in a blue sweater stood there, clutching her mug, her gaze fixed on him. She didn't look hostile, just unsure, like someone watching a stranger walk through a home she didn't remember selling. Her husband stepped up behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Even from this distance, Remy could see the question forming in the man's eyes. What is he doing here? Why is he back? Didn't the HOA say this place wasn't safe? Remy exhaled slowly. He had expected frustration. He had expected disrepair. He had expected bureaucratic nuisance. He, hadn't expected the feeling crawling up the back of his neck now. Something cold, heavy, uninvited. Someone had spent a lot of time rewriting his story. Someone had stood in front of a room full of new residents and explained who he was before he ever walked back into this bay. Someone had labeled him a problem long before he arrived, and they'd made sure everyone believed it. He turned away from the railing and walked back inside. The house swallowed him in its quiet, glass-filtered light. He could feel the weight of the violations in his pocket, stiff paper bending as he moved. He set the notices on the counter and reached for the nearest cabinet, the one where he'd kept documents sealed in waterproof sleeves years ago. He tugged the handle. The latch clicked. Dust puffed out as the door swung open. Inside, the binder sat exactly where he left it. County surveys, insurance records, engineering permits, coastal zoning approvals. Not a single document indicated condemnation. Not one. His pulse calmed, steadied. Evidence didn't lie. People did. Wind rattled the glass, pushing mist up along the windows like fragile white fingers. He straightened. The HOA could plaster violations across every glass panel of this house, but he had something they didn't. The truth. And he knew something else now, too, something that pushed quietly at the back of his thoughts like a tide turning beneath the surface. They weren't just hostile. They were afraid. But afraid of what? Or of who? The fog thinned as the morning stretched toward noon, leaving long streaks of sunlight cutting across the great room. Dust motes drifted through the beams in lazy spirals, moving as if the house itself were exhaling after too many years of silence. Remy set the binder of old property documents on the counter, feeling the familiar weight of it settle beneath his palms. He flipped through each section slowly, page by page, the original engineering permits stamped by the county, shoreline impact reports with his father's signature, environmental clearances he'd personally filed. The papers were yellowed at the edges, but intact, untouched by anyone except him. Nothing in them supported what Bethany claimed. No provisional condemnation, no structural hazard designation, no community safety order. If anything, the paperwork confirmed the opposite. The structure had been approved, inspected, and cleared more thoroughly than any home in the district. His father's meticulous nature practically oozed from every technical drawing and margin note. He closed the binder softly. Something was wrong. Far beyond the usual HOA power trip. Someone had faked official documents. Someone had carefully rewritten the narrative around this cliff house. Someone wanted him gone before he even stepped foot inside. A faint metallic clink drew his attention. Through the glass wall, he caught sight of a figure walking along the cliff path. A man in a neon HOA vest carrying a clipboard. He paused, scribbled something, snapped a photo of the house with a tablet, then continued toward the overlook that bordered Remy's property line. Remy's jaw tightened. Another violation, probably. Or a new one they'd invented just for him. He walked to the main door, swung it open, and stepped out onto the upper patio. The wind slapped lightly against his shirt, bringing with it the sharp scent of seaweed drying somewhere on the rocks below. He followed the path upward toward the section where the cliff flattened, boots crunching on gravel and broken shells. The HOA inspector didn't turn until Remy was close enough to see the plastic badge clipped to his vest. T. Hollis, Property Safety. "Morning," Remy said, voice even. The inspector nearly jumped out of his shoes. He fumbled with the tablet, straightened himself, then cleared his throat as though returning to the script he'd been given. Sir, this is an active inspection area. You're not supposed to be within 50 feet of the hazard perimeter." "What hazard?" Remy asked. Hollis tapped the tablet like it held commandments. "Structural instability, unapproved modifications, coastal violations. I'm documenting the deficiencies for the association's legal team. You should have been notified." "I wasn't," Remy said. "Funny how that keeps happening." Hollis swallowed, eyes darting anywhere but at him. "Look, I'm just here to do the walkthrough. It's all in the order." "What? Order?" Remy pressed. "Where did it come from? County? State? FEMA? Anyone real?" The inspector's face reddened. I don't know. I was just assigned the report and told not to deviate from the checklist." Remy stepped closer, not threatening, but grounded, solid, steady, the kind of presence that made a man question the instructions he'd been given. "Let me see the order." Hollis hesitated, sweat beading just below his hairline. I'm not supposed to show." Remy didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. Something in the silence made the inspector crack. He thrust the tablet forward with a trembling hand. A PDF filled the screen. Dense paragraphs, official formatting, county logo, structural hazard notation. For a moment, it almost looked legitimate, until Remy saw the metadata near the bottom corner. Date modified 32 hours ago. And beneath that, created by SBA Coastal Committee 17. He scrolled further. Committee formation date, 3 months ago. Hazard designation date, 6 years ago. The same impossible discrepancy he'd seen on Bethany's tablet. Another forged document. Someone in the HOA wasn't just overreaching. They were manufacturing a legal past that had never existed. Remy handed the tablet back, his voice low. You might want to keep your name off whatever they're building here. Hollis blanched, nodded stiffly, and hurried away down the path, nearly tripping on loose gravel as he retreated toward the ridge. When he was gone, Remy turned his gaze back toward the mansion. From the upper tier, the afternoon sun hit the curved glass, warping reflections into something between waves and warning lights. For a moment, he could almost see his father's silhouette standing in one of the upper windows, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket. What did they do to this place, Dad? He murmured. The wind swallowed the question. He walked back inside, grabbed his waterproof field journal from his duffel, and set it beside the binder of legal documents. He began recording everything. Times, dates, photos, notes about forged metadata, the sequence of HOA actions, the contradictions between committee creation and hazard orders. This was how engineers solved problems. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with documentation. Paper trails didn't lie. People eventually did. As he worked, shadows lengthened across the floors. The surf grew louder, rising with the tide, booming against the cliff. The house felt almost like a companion, standing silently with him, patient, weathered by storms of nature and now by storms of people. By evening, he had filled 20 pages with evidence, but it wasn't until he stepped onto the terrace to clear his head that he felt the shift. The neighborhood was quieter now, lights glowing in rows along the ridge, but on one balcony, the same woman from earlier stood again. She wasn't whispering this time. She was staring. Really staring. Not with fear, with guilt. As if she knew something she couldn't say. As if she'd watched something unfold over the years that hadn't felt right, but hadn't dared question it. Their eyes met across the water. She dropped her gaze and hurried inside. A cold unease slid up Remy's spine. This wasn't merely an HOA power grab. This was orchestrated, layered, hidden under bureaucracy like rot beneath fresh paint. And if neighbors were afraid to make eye contact, what else had Bethany buried beneath her committees and bylaws? As the wind picked up, the last of the daylight spread across the water like beaten copper. Remy turned back toward the living room and shut the door softly behind him. Whatever story they'd built about him, he was going to dismantle it, piece by piece. But the next morning, they made the first move. It began as a faint vibration, so subtle he thought it was the refrigerator compressor kicking on. But then the low rumble grew louder. Tires, engines, multiple, rolling up the cliff road, accelerating with purpose. Remy stepped out onto the terrace just as the first flash of red-blue light broke across the glass like a lightning strike. He froze. On the grassy rooftop above, where wildflowers had once grown between tufts of native sedge, 3 sheriff's cruisers had come to a stop in a sharp triangular formation. Another turned in behind them, lights painting the morning mist in frantic colors. Doors swung open. Officers stepped out. 6, then 8, then more. Silhouettes in tan uniforms against the pale sky. And at the center of them all stood Bethany Reed. Her suit was even brighter today, an electric shade of pink bordering on neon. The morning sun caught the fabric and made it blaze. She held a binder clutched tight against her ribs, thick enough to choke a paper shredder. Her heels clicked rhythmically as she marched toward the main rooftop stairwell, her entourage of HOA board members trailing behind like anxious ducklings. Remy swore under his breath. This wasn't an inspection. This was a raid. He hurried back inside, grabbed the binder of original property documents, then stepped out again, positioning himself at the base of the exterior stairwell that spiraled up the cliff-facing side of the house. The first officer appeared at the top of the stairs, hand resting on his holster. "Mr. Cole," he called down, voice amplified by the wind off the ocean. "The Sterling Bay HOA has filed an emergency safety complaint. We're here to enforce a community hazard order." "That's not a thing," Remy said flatly. "There is no such order, and they have no authority here." Bethany's voice sliced clean through the surf. "Deputy, do not engage with unauthorized occupants. This man has refused repeated notices and continues to reside in a condemned structure. Proceed with detainment." She reached the edge of the roof and leaned over the railing, pointing down at Remy like he was a wild animal that had wandered into her garden. "You had your chance," she shouted. "You were warned." Remy held up his binder. "I have every legal document proving this property belongs to me, and that the county has never condemned this structure. If you want to talk safety, let's talk about the fraudulent committee bylaws you seem to enjoy printing." A murmur passed through the officers. One deputy, the younger man from the day before, shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between Remy and Bethany. She snapped her fingers at him. "Deputy Stahl, you heard the reports. He's trespassing. He's refusing orders. And the structure is unstable. Proceed." Stahl swallowed, jaw tightening. "Sir," he called to Remy, "for your safety and ours, we need you to come upstairs and answer a few questions at the station." "For my safety," Remy echoed. "You brought half the sheriff's department onto my roof." The older deputy stepped forward, voice firm but not unkind. "Mr. Cole, please cooperate. If the paperwork is legitimate, we'll get it sorted out." Bethany gave a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, the paperwork is legitimate," she said, her smile twisting. "Ours, at least." She lifted her binder and let a stack of papers fall open dramatically. Printed notices, graphs, photos taken out of context. Violations, more violations, structural warnings, an entire manufactured truth. 17 safety citations in 48 hours, she declared. "I had to protect this community. You brought this on yourself." Remy blinked slowly. 17 citations? I've been here 2 days. "Exactly," she snapped. Then she raised her voice to the officers. "You see? Non-compliant. Unpredictable. He refuses to acknowledge community governance. He won't even leave the hazardous zone. Get him out of there." 2 deputies started down the stairs. A third followed. The young one remained at the top, eyes conflicted. Remy lifted his hands slightly. Not surrender, but openness, calmness. "I'm not resisting," he said. "But before I go anywhere, someone needs to acknowledge that this house isn't condemned. That paperwork is fake. The metadata alone," Bethany cut him off with a triumphant scoff. "There he goes again, making up conspiracy theories. Deputies, do your job." The first deputy reached him. "Turn around, sir." The wind gusted hard across the terrace, whipping Bethany's hair into a pale halo and sending salt spray up against the glass. Somewhere below, a wave slammed into the cliff with a deep, hollow thud. Remy met the deputy's eyes and nodded. He wasn't going to win a shouting match against the HOA president, not in front of an audience stacked against him. He knew the rules. You didn't fight the tide at its strongest point. You waited until it began to turn. He slowly turned around. The metal clicked cold around his wrists. The humiliation didn't strike all at once. It came in pulses, first the sting of the cuffs, then the weight of every balcony now filling with onlookers. People he'd never met. People who believed a story someone else had written. Bethany stepped into view on the stairs, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You're done here, Mr. Cole. The community has spoken. We protect our own." He lifted his head, inhaled, and spoke evenly. I am one of your own. Bethany's smile faltered for half a second, a flicker of something he didn't understand. The deputies guided him up the stairs, through the line of patrol cars, and toward the waiting vehicle. As he walked, the younger deputy, Stahl, fell into step beside him. "Sir," Stahl murmured, almost too quietly to hear, "I don't know what's going on with the HOA, but something doesn't feel right. We'll sort it out at the station. Just keep calm." "I am calm," Remy said. "But tell me something." Stahl looked over. "Why?" Remy asked. "Are you enforcing a condemnation order that predates the committee that issued it?" Stahl stopped walking. His face changed. Not dramatically, not with shock, but with recognition. As if he had suspected something was off, but hadn't yet found the thread to pull. Before he could respond, Bethany's voice rang out again. "Deputy Stahl, do not fraternize with the trespasser. Get him in the car." Her words hit the air sharp and brittle, but Stahl's hesitation lingered. And that small hesitation, that thin sliver of doubt in someone with actual authority, was enough to send a quiet ripple across Remy's thoughts. They were losing their grip. The manufactured narrative was cracking. He let the deputies guide him to the patrol car, let the door open, let his head duck under the frame. As he lowered himself into the back seat, the sun broke through the clouds and flashed across the bay, throwing silver light across every surface. The docks, the water, the glass of his home. He whispered, almost to himself, "You can't rewrite an entire coastline." Then the door shut, muffling the sea and sealing the next stage of the fight. The drive down the coastal road was strangely smooth, almost serene. Through the rear window, Remy watched the mansion shrink until it was nothing but a glimmer of curved glass on the cliff. The sheriff's cruiser hummed along the asphalt, the radio crackling with static and unrelated dispatches, while Deputy Stahl glanced at him now and then through the rearview mirror, quick, conflicted looks he didn't try to hide. The station sat near the old harbor, a squat concrete building that still smelled faintly of brine, diesel fuel, and the wooden nets that fishermen once dried along the docks. Remy stepped out, hands freed but the cuff's cold imprint still tingling along his wrists. Inside, the lobby hummed with fluorescent lights, their harsh glow reflecting off beige walls and scuffed tile. A bored receptionist typed mechanically, glancing up only once. Officers moved about with the slow momentum of a place used to sorting weekend bar fights, not HOA-driven civil disputes. "Sit tight, Mr. Cole," Stahl said, guiding him to a small interview room. "We need to go over the report and verify your documents. It might take a little while." "Take your time," Remy said. "Truth doesn't rush." Stahl hesitated at the doorway, then quietly added, "For what it's worth, those dates you pointed out, they don't make sense. At all." Then he closed the door. Remy sat alone for several minutes, listening to the muted hum of voices beyond the walls. The room was cool, the metal table cold through his elbows. A single vent rattled overhead like a loose piece of rigging on a stormy night. Eventually, a knock sounded. The door swung open, and in stepped a man Remy hadn't expected to see again. Jake Mercer, the old harbor master. Jake filled the doorway with the presence of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. His denim jacket looked older than the station itself. His beard was silvered and wiry, framing a face seamed with salt, sun, and time. His eyes, pale, watery blue, carried the weight of someone who had watched coastlines rise and fall, both literally and metaphorically. He closed the door behind him without a word. For a moment, he just looked at Remy. "Boy," he finally said, voice gravelly, "I told your father this place would bring trouble." Remy stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. "Jake?" "In the flesh." The old man tapped the table. "Sit. We got talking to do." Remy lowered himself slowly. Jake took the opposite chair, joints cracking as he sat. From inside his jacket he pulled a thick, beaten-up leather envelope, edges frayed, corners softened by decades of salt air. He set it on the table. "Your daddy kept records," Jake said. "I kept copies." Remy stared. "Of what?" Jake unfastened the brass clasp. Papers spilled out. Maps, charts, surveys drawn in pencil with a draftsman's hand. Old photographs. A laminated permit yellowed by age. A few sheets crisp with navy blue letterhead from agencies that no longer existed. "The truth," Jake said simply. He pushed the stack toward Remy. "You've been gone a long time, son. Long enough for folks up there." He jerked his chin toward the cliffs. "To forget this bay had a past before their pastel houses and walkway lamps." Remy thumbed through the documents, heart thudding. He recognized some of them immediately. His father's handwriting, the curve of his letters, the notes scribbled in margins. But others were older than he'd ever seen. Some carried county seals from before the district had been reorganized. Others bore federal markings so obscure most locals wouldn't recognize them. Jake leaned back. "You ever wonder why your father chose that cliff? Why he built a seawall deeper than any private home needed? Why he insisted on foundation pins sunk 38 feet instead of 20? Remy looked up slowly. "I figured he was being thorough." "He wasn't thorough," Jake said. "He was obeying a designation." The word hit Remy like a shift in current. "Designation," he repeated. "Aye." Jake pulled out a folded nautical chart, edges worn soft. He flattened it on the table, the crisp sound of unfolding paper echoing in the small room. "This bay, and the bottom it sits on, ain't ordinary county land. It never was." He pointed to a note near the lower right, handwritten decades earlier. "Federal Maritime Territory, 1952. Provisional designation." "Federal," Remy whispered. Jake nodded. "Back in the 50s, this place was tagged for potential naval use. Never happened, but the status never got rescinded. Meant the seabed stayed under federal oversight. Never transferred to the county when they built the harbor district. Your dad knew that. I knew that. Most old-timers did." Remy blinked, stunned. Jake kept going. "When your father bought the cliff parcels, he didn't just buy dirt. He acquired shoreline rights tied into that old designation. Part of why the county approvals took so long. They had to cross-check with Washington." Remy looked back at the chart. Suddenly, the impossible began to make sense. Bethany's obsession with community jurisdiction, the fake condemnation papers, the HOA's sudden interest in declaring the mansion hazardous. They weren't just overreaching. They were covering something up. Jake sighed heavily. "Then your daddy died. You left to chase storms, build wave monitors, save folks from flooding halfway across the world. And the new crowd up on the ridge arrived." He tapped the table. "That woman, Bethany Reed, she don't like things she can't control. When she realized your cliff house sits on land tied to federal authority, not HOA bylaws." He gave a humorless chuckle. "Well, you became a problem she couldn't solve with a pink smile and a clipboard." Remy exhaled slowly. "So she rewrote the story." "Son," Jake said softly, "she rewrote the whole coastline." A silence fell between them, thick, weighted, humming with decades of buried truth. Then Jake reached into the envelope one more time and slid out a small, square photograph. It showed an old wooden dock, the one that used to stand before the modern marina, with a younger Remy holding a coil of rope beside his father. Jake's voice dropped. "Your father asked me to keep this stuff safe. Said someday someone might try to steal your bay from under you. Told me you'd know what to do when the time came." Remy's throat tightened. He touched the photograph lightly. "I didn't know." No, Jake said. But you do now. He stood slowly, knees popping. And you ain't alone. I've been watching what the HOA's been up to. Buying up shoreline, changing dock fees, pushing folks out with fake citations. I seen good families leave because they couldn't fight it. But this? He tapped the maritime chart. This they can't fake. Remy closed the binder of documents he'd brought and placed Jake's materials beside it. 2 stories, one fabricated, one real. Now they finally stood side by side. Stahl returned then, tapping lightly on the door before stepping in. He looked from Remy to the maps spread across the table. Mr. Cole, is everything all right in here? Jake answered for him. Deputy, he said, voice steady as surf against stone. This bay's about to get real complicated. Stahl blinked, unsure what that meant. But Remy knew. For the first time since he returned, he felt the tide shift. Not in his favor yet. Not fully. But enough to show the current had changed. Enough to show that truth had weight, and that someone besides him was willing to carry it. When Remy stepped out of the station an hour later, the fog had burned off completely. The sky was a deep, steady blue, one of those rare coastal days when the horizon looked sharp enough to slice your thumb on. The air smelled of rope tar and diesel drifting from the fishing boats, seagulls circling overhead in slow, rhythmic arcs. Jake stood just outside the station's door, leaning against the railing, like a man who'd been rooted there half a century. The old harbor master squinted against the sunlight, one hand shading his eyes. You good to go? He asked. For now, Remy said. Stahl's running the paperwork. He doesn't buy Bethany's version anymore. Jake grunted. He's got a brain on him, that one. Not always the rule with uniforms these days. They walked together toward the end of the pier. The tide lapped gently at the pylons, rocking the boards beneath their boots. Jake's steps were slow but sure, each one matched to the familiar rhythm of the sea. Somebody else is coming, Jake said. Who? Your lawyer. Remy stopped. I didn't call a lawyer. Aye, Jake replied, giving him a dry look. But she called you. Before he could ask what that meant, a silver SUV rolled into view near the dock entrance. The driver's door swung open, and a woman stepped out. Dark blazer, hair pulled back in a low knot, leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm. Sarah Mitchell. He hadn't seen her in nearly 3 years, but time hadn't dulled the sharpness in her eyes or the calm force she carried around her like a shield. She walked toward them with purpose, heels clicking against the boards. You look like hell, she said, stopping in front of him. You look the same, he replied. That's because I wasn't the one handcuffed on a cliff this morning. Her gaze softened. Remy, you okay? Better now, he said. But we've got a mess. Sarah lifted a brow. Jake filled me in. I've also been digging since you left a voicemail I couldn't understand because it cut off right after HOA and cuffs. Jake shrugged. She called me. I told her to get down here fast. Sarah opened her portfolio and removed several printouts. She spread them across a nearby bench, the pages fluttering in the ocean breeze. I pulled title history, coastal zoning maps, city council dockets, HOA filings, everything that should show up in a normal property dispute. She tapped one document, nails clicking sharply. Remy, your house is legally intact. No condemnation order on file with the county. No structural hazard designation. Nothing in state archives either. I figured as much, he said quietly. But that's not the interesting part, she went on. This is. She slid forward another document, an old deed transfer, stamped and notarized, naming a trust he knew well, the Bayfront Conservation Trust. The seabed rights, he said. All of them, Sarah confirmed. Plus the submerged foundation points, underwater access routes, the breakwater zone. Anything below the waterline that touches your cliff parcel. Her eyes lifted to meet his. Your father set this up very carefully, and you, Remy, are the sole trustee. Jake let out a low whistle. Told you, boy. Your daddy didn't build that place on a whim. Sarah wasn't done. She pulled out another set of papers, these thicker, bound with a binder clip. The HOA, she said, the word landing on the wood like a wet anchor, has been charging residents for dock access, mooring rights, bay permits, marina usage, and even kayak storage, on water they don't legally own. According to state law, they have zero authority below the high water mark. Remy's breath stilled. How much money? He asked. Millions, she said. Over 17 years. The wind carried the words out across the bay, where they dissolved into the crash of a wave. Jake shook his head slowly. They've been robbing folks blind. Sarah nodded. And it's worse. See this? She held up a page with highlighted lines. The Sterling Bay Coastal Committee? Not recognized by the state. Not listed as a legitimate coastal authority. Doesn't appear in county records until 3 months after the date stamped on the condemnation order. The same mismatch we found, Remy said. Forgery. Exactly, Sarah replied. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to create a paper trail that never existed. Remy stared at the documents, feeling the pieces slide into place like a puzzle he hadn't realized he'd been assembling. Bethany wasn't just power-hungry. She was desperate. She'd built an empire on a lie, one that crumbled the moment Remy stepped back into the bay with the real paperwork. Sarah crossed her arms. Remy, you don't just own a house. You own the water under this entire community. The HOA controls the ridge, but you control the bay. The words felt unreal even as he knew they were true. Jake clapped him on the shoulder, hard enough to make him sway. Means every dock, every mooring, every pretty boardwalk they brag about. It's all sitting on your land. A gull screeched above them, circling in a slow, looping arc. Sarah's voice dropped. And because the HOA never checked the original deeds, they've been charging illegal fees for years. What happens, Remy said, when this goes public? Sarah's expression sharpened. Bethany's empire collapses. Wind swept across the pier, rustling the documents. But, Sarah continued, we have to be smart. If we move too soon, she'll spin this as harassment or a loophole. If we wait too long, she'll bury evidence or intimidate half the community. We need the right moment, the right forum, and the right witnesses. Jake nodded. Folks are scared of her. But give 'em proof, they'll talk. Rema looked out over the bay. The water gleamed in the sunlight, calm, steady, unbothered by the chaos above. Boats bobbed gently against docks built on lies. Every pier, every post, every slip fee, the HOA claimed them, managed them, profited from them. But the truth ran deeper than the tide. You're the rightful owner, Sarah said softly. It's time they remembered that. He let out a slow breath. I'm not here to ruin the community, he said. I'm here to reclaim what's mine and stop them from hurting people who don't know the truth. Sarah nodded. Then we build a case. We document everything, and when the time comes, we hit them with the law. Jake grinned, revealing a set of teeth that had seen too many storms. And son, when that tide turns, it ain't turning back. Remy gathered the documents, feeling their weight, not just paper, but promise. The wind kicked up again, lifting a strand of Sarah's hair, rattling the rigging of a nearby boat. The bay stretched out before him, shimmering like a secret. And for the first time since stepping foot back in Sterling Bay, he felt not just the shift of a tide, but the start of a current he could ride. 2 days later, The current carried him straight into the heart of Sterling Bay's most orchestrated spectacle, the emergency hearing. By early morning, the sky above the ridge glowed with a bright, sharp clarity, the kind coastal towns only got after a night of heavy wind. It made everything look more vivid. The white edges of the cliff, the turquoise water rolling lazily beneath it, and the community center standing perched above the bay like a glass observatory. Remy followed Sarah up the steps to the center's entrance, binder and documents tucked beneath his arm. People clustered around the glass doors, couples in matching windbreakers, retirees with notebooks, young families with toddlers hanging off their hips. Some whispered when they saw him. Others stiffened and looked away. But a few looked curious, or worried, or quietly relieved. Inside, the community room was already filling. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform where state coastal commissioners arranged their microphones. A long table across the front held laptops, binders, and a pitcher of water that caught the light like molten silver. But all eyes snapped toward one person: Bethany Reed. The pink suit today was a deeper, more aggressive shade, magenta, nearly fuchsia, glowing like a warning flare under the lights. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup sharp enough to carve marble. She stood stiff-backed behind a wheeled cart stacked with posters, charts, and a thick binder labeled Community Safety Presentation. Sterling Bay, HOA, Official Records. Gideon Pierce, the HOA treasurer, hovered beside her, dark circles under his eyes, expression pinched with something between exhaustion and fear. When Bethany saw Remy, she didn't smile. She didn't blink. She didn't even breathe, from what he could tell. She simply stared, as if trying to will him into disappearing. Then her voice rang out, loud and clear. "Ah, Mr. Cole has arrived." She lifted her chin, gaze icy. "Now we may proceed with the removal of false claims and the restoration of community order." Sarah leaned close and whispered, "She's overconfident. That's good. People who think they've already won forget to check for traps." The commissioners took their seats. Someone shut the doors. The room quieted, and the hearing began. Bethany launched into her performance with the practiced confidence of someone long accustomed to commanding rooms like this. "Distinguished commissioners, residents of Sterling Bay," she began, sweeping an arm dramatically toward her first poster board. "For years, I have dedicated myself to preserving the environmental stability and property values of this community." She clicked a remote. The projector lit up with a photo of Remy's mansion, taken from the ridge, angled to make the structure look crooked and ominous. "A condemned hazard," she declared. "A blight on our coastline." Murmurs rippled across the crowd. She clicked again. More images. The house in dim lighting, edited to look cracked, slanted, shadowed. Then charts, colorful, dramatic, wildly inaccurate. Structural instability. Environmental contamination. Unapproved materials. Unauthorized residency. Each one accompanied by an official-looking document. Each one false. Remy felt Sarah stiffen beside him. Jake shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. Then came the kicker. Bethany slammed a thick binder onto the podium. "The Sterling Bay Coastal Committee has documented all violations. Our authority is recognized by community charter and reinforced by 17 years of precedent." She paused for effect. "And this individual, this outsider, seeks to undermine it all with fabricated paperwork." A low rumble of uneasy agreement passed through the room. But something else flickered too. Doubt. A commissioner lifted a hand. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "before we continue, could you clarify the jurisdiction of this coastal committee? Our records show limited recognition of such an entity." A crack. Hairline but unmistakable. Bethany's smile tightened. "The committee operates under HOA mandate That was not the question, the commissioner cut in gently. Do you or do you not have state-recognized authority over the bay waters? She inhaled sharply. That's irrelevant, she said. Too quickly. A soft rustle moved through the room. Sarah leaned toward Remy and whispered, There it is. The first unravel. The commissioner nodded slowly. Very well. We will revisit that shortly. Mr. Cole, your turn. The room shifted. Dozens of heads turned toward him. Remy rose slowly. No theatrics, no dramatic gestures, just a quiet, calm presence that felt solid as the cliff outside. He walked toward the podium, placed his binder gently on the surface, opened it, and began. My name is Remy Cole, he said, voice steady, carrying naturally through the chamber without strain. I am the legal owner of the cliffside home at parcels 27 and 31, and I am the trustee of the Bayfront Conservation Trust, holder of federal recognized seabed rights beneath Sterling Bay. A hush fell. Bethany's eyes widened, just a fraction. He continued. These documents, he lifted the first set, are the original county approvals for my home, signed, stamped, recorded. He placed them on the table. These, he held up another stack, are the coastal engineering permits filed under my father's name and renewed by me annually. All clean, all approved. Another soft thud on the table. And this, he lifted the maritime chart Jake had protected for decades, is the original federal designation from 1952, confirming that the seabed beneath Sterling Bay was never relinquished to local authority. The HOA has been charging dock fees on territory they do not own. Gasps, real ones, sharp inhales, murmurs, whispered curses. One man dropped his pen, and then Sarah stepped forward. There's more, she said. She connected her laptop to the projector and pulled up the metadata scans of the HOA's forged documents. Dates modified. Dates created. Committee formation dates that didn't match. Signatures inconsistent with county records. Logos copied from outdated templates. Every lie laid bare in crisp resolution. If the room had been uneasy before, now it trembled on the edge of outrage. I have filed a preliminary request for a full audit, Sarah said calmly. What we've shown today constitutes probable fraud. The commissioners conferred briefly, whispering behind their microphones. Then one spoke. Mrs. Reed, do you have an explanation for these discrepancies? Bethany opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. But this time no words came. Her face, usually so composed, drained of color under the fluorescent lights. Remy watched the realization sweep across her expression like a wave hitting a seawall. Everything she had built, every lie, every agenda, every manipulated resident, was folding in on itself. The commissioner cleared his throat. We will now request testimony from anyone directly affected by HOA enforcement actions. Mr. Mercer, you indicated you have records relevant to this matter. Jake rose slowly, his back straight despite the years. He approached the podium with the steady gait of a man who'd weathered storms far worse than this. As he began to speak, voice gravelly, truth heavy, the entire room leaned in. Bethany stared at him, her jaw clenched, her fingers trembled, her empire was slipping, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Jake adjusted his cap, cleared his throat, and set a folder of worn, yellowed documents on the podium. The papers rustled like dried leaves, fragile but stubborn, containing decades of truth that refused to be buried. My name's Jacob Mercer, he began, voice steady. I served as harbor master here for 32 years. Longer than this HOA's been alive. Longer than most of y'all have been living on that ridge. A few heads in the audience bowed, recognizing the weight of what was coming. Jake opened the first page. For 17 years, he said, things in this bay haven't smelled right. Fees that didn't match county codes. Violations written by committees that didn't exist. Folks getting pushed out one by one. Families that built this harbor long before it became a postcard. Someone in the crowd murmured, "I remember." Another nodded beside them. Jake continued, "I kept records. Not because I meant to get involved in politics. Lord knows I hate that. But because I saw good people afraid to speak. Folks paying for dock slips they already owned. Marina fees going up without approval. And every time anybody asked questions, he let the silence hang. They got hit with violations until they backed down." Several residents shifted in their seats, guilt flashing across their faces. People who'd seen pieces of the truth, but hadn't dared connect the dots. Jake held up a page stamped with a 1952 federal seal. This bay was designated maritime territory decades before this HOA existed, which means every dollar collected for water access should have gone through federal channels, not Mrs. Reed's clipboard. A gasp rippled across the room, louder now, heavier. Bethany stepped forward abruptly. "This man is mistaken. He has no authority." Jake didn't even look at her. "Sit down, Bethany," he said, flat as stone. "You've talked long enough." The room erupted, not loud, but sharp enough to sting. A few people clapped. Others covered their mouths in shock at seeing someone speak to her that way. Bethany lowered herself back into her chair, stiff and trembling. Jake continued, "I watched your daddy build that mansion," he said, turning slightly toward Remy. "Knew he wasn't just building a house. He was protecting a piece of coastline the government itself marked as critical. And I watched folks try to take it from him. But he had the paperwork, and now you got it too." He closed the folder. "That's all I got. But it's enough." When Jake stepped away from the podium, the commissioners exchanged looks, quiet, thoughtful, tense. One cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We've heard significant testimony today. We will review these documents carefully, but preliminary analysis indicates numerous irregularities in the HOA's claims." Then he looked directly at Bethany. "Mrs. Reed, do you have anything to say in response?" Bethany rose slowly, like a queen forced to step off her throne. Her voice cracked at first, then steadied as she tried to regain control. "These accusations are outrageous," she insisted. "The HOA has acted in good faith. We have protected this community from hazards and unregulated structures for nearly 2 decades. Mr. Cole's property poses environmental dangers. It disrupts community harmony. The chamber doors swung open with a sharp metallic thud. Everyone turned. 2 individuals in dark uniforms stepped inside. Federal marshals, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Their presence filled the room instantly, shifting the air like a gust before a storm. Behind them came a woman in civilian clothes wearing a No AA badge. She carried a laptop and a thick envelope. Bethany's words died in her throat. The lead marshal approached the commissioners and spoke quietly. The commissioners nodded. Then the marshal lifted his gaze to the audience. "Please remain seated." A collective breath held. Following an emergency review of financial records, marina permits, and coastal jurisdiction documents, he continued, "We have probable cause indicating fraudulent use of federal maritime territory and unauthorized collection of fees." Gideon Pierce, the HOA treasurer, stiffened violently. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands gripped the edge of his chair. Bethany rose again. "This is ridiculous," she burst out. "This is a misunderstanding. Our documents—" "Ma'am," the marshal interrupted bluntly, "your documents are under federal investigation." The NOAA official stepped forward next, voice calm but firm. "The seabed beneath Sterling Bay is federally regulated. Any entity collecting fees or enforcing jurisdiction without authorization is in violation of Title 18, Section 1443. Wire fraud. A low, collective gasp filled the air. The marshal turned to the HOA table. "Mrs. Reed, Mr. Pierce, please stand." Bethany's knees buckled. Gideon froze. Remy watched as the marshals approached, one on each side, their movements deliberate, professional, unhurried. Jake whispered under his breath, "Storm's here." Bethany's voice broke. "You can't. This is my community. I built this place." "You operated a commercial enterprise on federal land," the marshal said simply, "and you charged residents for access you didn't legally possess." When the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the sound echoed through the room like a gavel striking. Residents whispered. Some cried. Some stared in stunned silence. Some finally looked at Remy, not with suspicion, but with dawning understanding. The marshals turned next to Gideon Pierce. He swallowed hard. Then, in a hoarse whisper, he said, "Wait. I have something." He reached into his bag, hands trembling, and pulled out a flash drive. "I kept the real books," he said, "the ones she told me to hide. I'll cooperate. Just, please don't let her pin this all on me." Bethany lunged toward him despite the cuffs. "You traitor!" The marshals held her back. The commissioners looked shaken. Sarah turned to Remy, voice low. "You did it." Remy shook his head gently. "No," he said. "The truth did." As Bethany was led toward the exit, the soft buzz of voices grew louder, rippling across the room like a tide rising without warning. For the first time in 17 years, the community wasn't afraid of her, and the bay, at long last, was turning back toward the people who truly belonged to it. When the doors shut behind the marshals, the chamber fell into a stunned, fragile quiet. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore, but the silence of awakening, of people trying to understand how deep the lie had gone, how long they'd been living under its shadow. The commissioners cleared their throats and shifted papers, trying to gather themselves. Sarah gently rested a hand on Remy's arm, grounding him, reminding him to breathe. Jake, leaning on his cane, looked more proud than Remy had ever seen him. A commissioner finally spoke. "We will issue a full formal report," he said, voice steady now. "But based on the testimony and evidence presented today, the Sterling Bay HOA is hereby suspended pending federal review." A murmur swept the room. Another commissioner added, "All Bay-related enforcement actions issued in the past 17 years are void effective immediately." A woman in the second row covered her mouth with both hands. A man beside her sagged into his seat, shaking with quiet emotion. Others stared ahead, expressionless but trembling, realizing their fines, their forced sales, their worries had been built on nothing but manipulation. The moment felt like the tide pulling back before a wave. When the commissioners adjourned, people didn't rush out the doors. They gathered in small clusters, whispering, pointing, glancing at Remy like he had stepped out of some old story their parents used to tell. Some approached him. Others hovered close, unsure whether they had the right to speak to the man they'd misjudged, avoided, even feared. A young mother with a stroller offered a hesitant smile. You saved all of us," she said softly. Remy shook his head gently. "No, I just shined a light." An older fisherman stepped forward, voice hoarse. "Your father was a good man. I'm sorry we let her drown his memory." Jake grunted. "Well, you all finally learned to swim." The crowd even managed a shaky laugh. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled across the cliff like melted gold. Patrol cars were gone. The HOA golf cart sat abandoned near the walkway, its diamond-studded clipboard rattling in the breeze like an empty crown stripped of authority. Sarah, Remy, and Jake made their way down toward the cliff path. As they descended, more residents gathered, some apologizing, some simply nodding in silent gratitude. At the bottom of the hill, Remy paused. The sea mansion stood gleaming in the late light. It no longer looked like a battleground. It looked like what it had always been. A place built with purpose, rooted in truth, made to withstand storms, natural or otherwise. Jake let out a long, thoughtful breath. "Your father would have loved this part," he said. "The part where the truth finally comes up for air. The part," Jake corrected, "where the bay remembers who it belongs to." Sarah stepped beside Remy, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. "So," she asked, "what now?" Remy looked at the water, stained copper and blue, restless but calm, like a living thing exhaling after years of being held too tight. "Now," he said, "we rebuild." And rebuild they did. In the weeks that followed, federal auditors combed through 17 years of ledgers and forged filings. Dale Fincher, the coastal inspector on Bethany's payroll, was indicted. Gideon Pierce received probation after handing over the real books, his cooperation essential for exposing the full scheme. 14 families who had been forced out returned, each receiving the right to reclaim their homes at original sale prices. Some cried when they walked through their old front doors. Some fell to their knees in their empty yards. Others just stood still, stunned that the nightmare was finally over. The HOA dissolved entirely, by unanimous resident vote. A new, transparent residents' association formed in its place, this time with elected oversight and budgets visible to all. And Remy? He reopened the Sea Mansion, not just as a home but as a center for coastal research, fulfilling the purpose his father had envisioned long before the HOA tried to strangle it. Engineers, marine biologists, and conservationists visited regularly, working with Remy to restore water pathways and monitor currents along the bay. Children from the community visited too, wide-eyed, curious, asking about underwater drones, wave sensors, storm monitors. Remy taught them everything his father had taught him. On the anniversary of the hearing, the community gathered on the open shoreline for a celebration. No gates, no permits, no oversight demanding payment for standing near the water. Music played from a portable speaker. Kids chased each other through the surf. Couples picnicked on the sand. Jake raised a plastic cup of lemonade toward Remy. "To truth," he said. "To tide," Remy answered. "To the day this place stopped being scared," Jake added. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Remy slipped away to the glass terrace of his mansion. He stood alone leaning on the railing, watching the water shimmer beneath him. Waves crashed against the rocks in pulses, steady, certain, ancient. He inhaled deeply, letting the ocean air fill his lungs. If there was one thing the sea had taught him, it was patience. People tried to build lies on top of it, tried to ignore it, tried to bend it to their will. But the sea didn't bend. It remembered. It waited. It returned. Some people built power through fear. He had built his on truth. And the tide, always, always, brought truth back. If you've ever had to stand your ground against someone who thought they could rewrite the rules, drop a simple "yes" in the comments. Stories like this remind us that truth doesn't shout. It just waits for the moment it finally gets heard. And if you'd like to ride along for more tales of justice, grit, and good folks fighting back the right way, feel free to subscribe and stay with us for the next one.